Thank you for making it all 6 weeks. Yay. Good job for you guys. But we are not going to tiptoe across this finish line. We're going to sprint across the finish line. We have a lot to cover today and a lot of really good stuff. And I told Jan yesterday as I was prepping for, just kind of reviewing stuff for today, I'm the most excited about this one because to me this is the culmination of not only our time together, but just for me, this is what we'll talk through today is really putting skin on what we've been talking about. And it's not just how do we discover who we are, who God says we are, and our value, but how does that play out in our lives, right? How does that start to restore relationships, or at least restore us? And so we can take, because I think I said at the very, very beginning, for a little while it's got to be about you, so that eventually it's not about you, right? It's about how we live our lives for others. How do we find our calling and live in that? Because if this was all about just you finding who you are and your value, that's great. But God does that for a purpose, for you, but also for the world that you're living in. He puts you in your world, and even with your story, He wants to restore your story because there's something in your story that your world needs, right? A restored story. I would not be up here and be able to speak to you guys if God hadn't, and still isn't, restoring my story. I wouldn't have anything to say. I would still be spiraling downwards if I would still be alive. But God can restore our stories, and that's what I'm so excited about today. To really talk about where we've been and what today is and kind of the culmination, we're really finally narrowing down on that last voice. And last week we talked more about how do you hear that beckoning voice of a father and what's He trying to do and what it requires. We talked about how the reality is we have to unseat our dads ultimately off this throne that we put them on, even inadvertently. And this week we're going to talk about how do we replace that fatherless cycle? How does God reverse that? And what I mentioned last week, which will connect into what we're talking about today, is that first step in reversing the fatherless cycle is reversing denial, and that God uses disruption and desire is what we talked about last week. So here's a great C.S. Lewis quote that I've always loved because I think it speaks to how we settle for our normal. He says, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by an offer of a holiday by the sea, we are far too easily pleased. We get so settled in normal, right? Just kind of living what we feel like is our normal. So God's got to disrupt that. And I always wonder, why does He allow this disruption and why does He build this desire up in us? Charles Spurgeon said, "The sweetest prayers God ever hears are the groans and sighs of those who have no hope in anything but His love." And in one sense, that seems like a kind of a hard, cruel place to be. But on the other hand, that's exactly where we find our life, is there. And so God takes us on this journey. One more quote I'm going to read to you is from a blog post from a guy named Glenn Stanton. The blog post is Fatherhood, the Core of the Universe. He said, "Fatherhood is not merely a motif that God chose as He revealed Himself to us, nor is it merely an anthropomorphic device to relate to us. Jesus called Him Father because He is. As the Trinitarian God is the center of the universe and of all reality, so is fatherhood." Fatherhood. He really is a father. I don't know, anyone here know who George MacDonald is? Okay. For those of you who don't, he was a 19th century Scottish author, poet, minister, and he actually influenced two other writers, one of them that I use a lot, C.S. Lewis, but he also influenced a writer named G.K. Chesterton. Okay? There are two of Christianity's greatest 20th century writers. They both attribute their faith and their writing to George MacDonald. In fact, C.S. Lewis said in his book, George MacDonald, an Anthology, he said about George MacDonald, this is C.S. Lewis talking, he said, the most important thing we can know about George MacDonald is that an almost perfect relationship with his father was the earthly root of all his wisdom. From his own father, speaking of George MacDonald's father, he said, he first learned that fatherhood must be the core of the universe. He was thus prepared in an unusual way to teach that religion in which the relation of father and son and daughter is of all relations the most central. So C.S. Lewis is talking about George MacDonald and how George MacDonald realized that fatherhood was the most central relationship in the universe. Then George MacDonald said himself, this is and has been the Father's work from the beginning, to bring us into the home of his heart. And unless you think this is just, these writers, this is what we went through last week. All these things that the Bible's trying to tell us about a father, right? We went through these about, this is our Father. This is what Jesus was trying to shake us out of, this fog, to say, this is who your Father is. He watches for his runaway child. He celebrates when he comes home. He runs to his child. He engages in creation. He knows when what we would call an insignificant bird falls from the sky. That's our Father. He knows how many hairs are on your head. He gives you a name that he himself has come up with. We went on. He's given you the name of sought after in Isaiah. He invites you to call him Daddy, Abba, Daddy, Dada. He's an artist. He designed you in the womb. He unleashed a grand rescue mission. And then we went on to say, he specifically chosen you, specifically adopted you. The Bible says he gives us the right to be called the children of God. Right? Christ gives us that right. So we've got a great, great Father. And so we talked about the fatherless cycle. And this is where I want to start today, is how does this get reversed? How does the fatherless cycle get reversed?